in a nutshell, really, your approach is remarkably simple, isn't it? As I understand it, it's basically teaching kids knowledge as opposed to learning skills, whatever it might be, knowledge, and also discipline. I mean, basically, those are the two, isn't that right, the two columns of your approach?
Yeah, that is right. So when you say teaching knowledge, what we mean is we value, I suppose a kind of political way of thinking about this is that it's more conservative to think about giving knowledge to the future generations. Yeah. Roger Scruton would think very much that that is the point of education, that it's our duty as educators to pass on knowledge from our generation to the following generations so that the country can do well. That's how Scruton would view it. And then there's the more left approach, which is education is about creating revolutionaries and getting them to overthrow typical thinking and to getting them to question. And I'm all for questioning and being critical in your thinking. My argument would be you can't do that without the knowledge, right? So then there are a bunch of people in the middle who will say that, who will say, well, wait a minute, we want our children to be critical thinkers, so we need to give them lots of knowledge. And I suppose that's kind of where we're at. Although obviously my teachers, they think a variety of different things, but certainly that's where I'm at. You cannot get children to be critical and to be creative and to think outside the box and to think independently if they don't know very much. And at secondary school, it is our duty to give them that. When they go on to the sixth form, when they go on to university, then they can use that knowledge to create. But a 12-year-old can't create that much. And if they do create something, we are patronizing them when we say, isn't this the most extraordinary thing ever? Because actually it's not, because they don't know very much to be able to do much with it. And sadly, over the last 50 or 60 years, we've sort of lost that in education. A teacher is more a facilitator of learning, moving around the desks that are grouped together while the children are leading the learning, as opposed to the teacher leading the learning. I always say the teacher should be driving the bus, the children get on the bus, and it is for the teacher to keep the children on the bus, right? And if one gets bored, oh, he's jumped off, it's for the teacher to make sure he gets back on. And that we do throughout the school. And so when visitors come, they're always so impressed by the amount our children know and just how clever they are at thinking and at being creative because they've got the knowledge to do that with. And then the discipline. I mean, there's lots of schools who also have, high standards of discipline. Sadly, there are many people out there campaigning to have poor discipline. And I know people think, wow, that's ridiculous, Catherine. How could they be doing that? They don't go around saying what we want is poor discipline. What they say is, we don't want punishments. We think it's mean to punish children. So we shouldn't do that. What you need is to have a restorative justice conversation with them where you talk about what's gone wrong. Now, of course you want to have a conversation with the child because you want him to understand what he's done wrong. But if there's no punishment that goes along with it, I can tell you they are going to ignore the conversation.
Because I think kids. I remember we were exactly the same when I was at school. You knew when a teacher was trying to be down with you and everything, and you would kind of exploit it in a way.
Exactly.
I think the point that you're making is very interesting. The idea, for example, that it almost amounts to sort of maybe that knowledge is somehow going to imprison these kids, but in fact, knowledge sets you free, doesn't it? I mean, this is the point. If you want to be free in thinking, and you have to have structure and you have to have knowledge.
Well, I can tell you the thinking behind it, which is that remember they want to reject the establishment, right? That's the
thing.
impetus.
This is what you're saying.
That's the gut feeling there. And so dead white men, it makes them go, ooh, I don't like that, because they don't like the power that comes with it. The power structure is such that these white men are on top and they don't want that. So they don't want to teach all that stuff. It's about the content that they really don't like ultimately. And they want to reject that. So if you're teaching skills, then you don't have to decide which knowledge is more important, because the problem with teaching knowledge is you've got to decide which bits of knowledge you're going to teach, right? And then it becomes very political. Should you read Shakespeare or should you read Benjamin Zephaniah? And then people say things like, well, you just read both. But we all know there's only so much time in the school day. The curriculum has to choose, right? And so then you come to the point of, well, what is the point of school? And again, the divide between right and left, I would say the right would see it more as schools are there to help socialize children, to help make them feel like they're part of a country, that they are British, that they learn their British history, that they read their British literature, that they are part of a certain something. The left would see it more as, no, we want to reject all those things. We don't want them to see themselves as British. Actually, being British is something we might feel a little bit ashamed about, because look at the terrible things that have happened in British history, slavery and so on. These are all awful. We might not think about the fact that Britain was a leading light in abolishing slavery, but we want to ignore that, And because of the guilt, I think, that sits on people's shoulders for being British, they don't really want to teach that. And so then it comes to this idea, well, actually what we want to do is teach skills. Now that's my own philosophy on that, about why we've come to this point. Yeah. A lot of people wouldn't necessarily think that consciously, now teachers are teaching, and they are told that the way in which children come to really understand something is by directing their own learning. But how is a 12-year-old meant to direct their own learning? I mean, take it down to a 5-year-old. How is a 5-year-old meant to know the difference between a triangle and a square unless you just tell him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He can't figure it out. It's impossible. Now, this ultimately started with Rousseau. Rousseau thought that you needed to draw it out of the child as opposed to putting it in. You definitely have to put it into the child. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't then analyze it. You can't toss it around in the classroom and do a bit of paired work and think about it. Of course you can.
Yes.
That will help the child properly understand it and properly retain it, It's not a question of just, the caricature of knowledge teaching is, it's just rote learning. Children just sit there like parrots and repeat after the teacher, and that's all that's going on. That's not what's happening. Not in a good classroom. And if you come to Michaela's classrooms, you will see all sorts of energy and all sorts of thinking and understanding going on. But that's because, in part, we give them knowledge, and we also want them to learn it so that they know it. Memory is part of what learning is.
You were a teacher for quite a long time before you set up. You've always been a teacher, haven't you?
Yep.
You're from a long line of teachers, aren't you? Or at least from your
my father taught at university, and
But have you always felt this way? I mean, or did you have, as it were, more of the kind of orthodox view of education at one time? Did you change?
Yeah, well, I went through teacher training. So sadly, teacher training teaches everyone how to teach the wrong way. I mean, that's a big statement, but it's true. Okay, teacher training is all wrong, and so. I mean, when teachers come to Michaela, for instance, we teach them how to teach differently. They all have to go through a process of becoming a Michaela teacher. So I went through teacher training like everybody else, and of course I did loads of games. In fact, in those days, so we're looking at early 21st century. In those days. There was no talk of knowledge versus skills. I mean, that conversation didn't exist. Right. All you ever did, it was just considered normal that you taught skills, and that you wanted children to get up out of their chairs in the classroom and move around, and you wanted to do brain gym and flap your arms around, and learning styles, and all of this stuff was just standard in teaching. Yep. Since 2010, what is great is that there's much more of a conversation around what works and what doesn't work. Right. We're now looking at brain science, we're now looking at research, we're now saying, hey, look, you know what? This doesn't work. Now, for me, it's always been about the children in front of you. And so I learned quickly that stuff just didn't work. I taught French. So I used to just think, well, maybe it works for other subjects. It just doesn't work for French, because that was what I taught, So I thought, well, it just doesn't work for languages. It's just different. Yeah. And so I did we did verb tables, and we did the kind of more old-fashioned stuff. And guess what? My kids did really well, right? Michaela, the woman, who we named the school after, she's originally from St. Lucia. Sadly, she died of cancer in 2011. She was exactly like that. Very old-fashioned. She used to talk about rigor. She used to say, where is the rigor, Catherine? And she was all about discipline, all about the kids just working hard, and traditional teaching. And she would stand in front of the classroom, despite all the fads and despite being told to do differently, which is why we named the school after her.